You know yourself better than most people do, and it hasn't changed anything. You have done the reading, you have had the conversations, you have enough self-awareness to recognize your patterns, name your wounds, trace most of your reactions back to something that makes sense. And yet, the same relationships keep ending the same way. The same opportunities keep slipping through the same hands. The same version of you keeps showing up in the moments that matter most. The one you swore you were done being. That is the paradox nobody warns you about. The more conscious you become of one half of your psyche, the more blindly the other half runs your life. Jung spent decades watching this exact dynamic destroy people who were, by every visible measure, trying. His wife, Emma Jung, herself a practicing analyst and one of the founding figures of the Zurich school, spent years mapping this same force from the inside, documenting its manifestations with a precision that still hasn't been surpassed. What they found between them was not a theory about balance or wholeness in any comfortable sense. It was something harder. Evidence that the psyche is not a single self becoming more refined, but two opposing dimensions in permanent tension. And that the one you have been ignoring has been quietly making your most consequential decisions for you. Every man carries an inner feminine dimension, the anima. Every woman carries an inner masculine one, the animus. Not a metaphor, not a cultural artifact, a functional structure of the psyche, present without exception, carrying everything you refuse to develop, and exerting pressure on your life in exact proportion to how long you have refused it. The life you keep almost living, that's it pushing back. Most people encounter this force without ever naming it. They feel it as the attraction that defies logic, the rage that arrives before thought, the creative paralysis that has no explanation, the tenderness that surfaces only in crisis. They manage it, suppress it, project it onto partners, blame it on circumstance. What they do not do, what almost no one does, is turn toward it deliberately and ask what it is trying to become. By the end of this video, you will know exactly which stage of development your anima or animus is locked in, why it is sabotaging your relationships and your decisions without your awareness, and what you can do, concretely, starting today, to stop being governed by the half of yourself you have never met. This is not self-help. This is a map of the psychic structure that is already shaping your life. The only question is whether you choose to read it. You have a gender, and then you have everything your gender was never supposed to be. That second part, the part culture spent centuries telling you to discard, suppress, or hand over to someone else, is not gone. It never was. It went underground, into the layer of the psyche Jung called the unconscious, where it kept developing on its own terms, outside your awareness, accumulating force in direct proportion to how thoroughly you ignored it. Jung named it with precision, the anima in men, the animus in women. Not a poetic gesture toward balance, a functional psychic structure with its own logic, its own needs, and its own way of making itself heard when you refuse to listen. Emma Jung, writing in Animus and Anima, defined the animus as the masculine principle alive in the female psyche, rooted in what she called logos, the capacity for directed thought, decisive action, independent judgment, and the kind of assertion that does not require another person's permission to exist. For a woman whose personality was shaped by a culture that pathologized those qualities in her, the animus does not disappear. It goes inward, and from inside, it operates as a compensatory force, showing up as the internal voice that criticizes with a brutality no external critic could match, or as the sudden rigidity that arrives in an argument and cannot be reasoned with, or as the creative drive that burns with nowhere to go. For the man, the anima is the feminine principle alive in the male psyche, what Jung described in Aion as the archetype of life itself, the bearer of eros, the function of relationship and emotional depth that civilization asked him to trade for productivity and stoicism. When a man has no access to his anima, he does not become simply unemotional. He becomes emotionally dependent without knowing it, outsourcing his entire inner life to the women around him, collapsing when they leave, becoming brittle and sentimental in ways he would never recognize as feminine because he has no framework for what is actually happening. Here is the first concrete thing to do with this. Take the area of your life where you feel most chronically blocked, not unlucky, not circumstantially frustrated, but blocked in a way that follows you across jobs, relationships, creative projects. That persistent blockage is almost never about external conditions. It is almost always about the dimension of your psyche that you are not using. The man who cannot sustain emotional intimacy is not bad at relationships. He is cut off from the relational capacity his anima carries. The woman who cannot act on her own judgment without seeking validation is not lacking confidence in the ordinary sense. She is cut off from the decisive force her animus holds. The anima and animus are not problems to be solved. They are resources being withheld from yourself, by yourself, for reasons that made sense once and have long since stopped serving you. In Aion, Jung wrote that these archetypes personify those contents of the unconscious which, when withdrawn from projection, can be integrated into consciousness, meaning the force you keep seeing in other people, the quality you keep falling for or resenting in partners, the capacity you keep outsourcing to someone else, is yours. It has always been yours. You just haven't claimed it yet. But before you can claim it, you need to know where it currently stands. Because the anima and animus do not arrive fully formed. They develop through 4 distinct stages, from the most primitive and destructive to the most integrated and generative. And the stage yours is locked in right now determines more about your life than most of the decisions you believe you are making freely. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. Most people assume their inner life is either healthy or damaged. Jung's framework refuses that binary entirely. The anima and animus do not exist in a fixed state. They develop, or fail to, through 4 distinct stages, each one representing a more sophisticated relationship between the conscious personality and the inner opposite. Jung mapped the animus progression with particular precision in Animus and Anima, drawing on Goethe's Faust to name the 4 principles of the masculine: force, action, word, and meaning. Each stage has a representative in life, in dreams, in the patterns of attraction and conflict that repeat across relationships. And each stage, if left unexamined, produces its own specific brand of damage. The first stage is pure force. For women, the animus here projects onto physical power, dominance, the figure who acts without deliberation. Jung pointed to the heroes of legend, the athletes, the men who move through the world with a certainty that requires no justification. The attraction is visceral and often baffling in retrospect. For men, the anima at this level is purely biological. Eve, the body, appetite, the pull toward the physical that carries no psychological content whatsoever. Relationships governed by this stage feel intensely alive in the beginning and hollow very quickly, because there is nothing behind the charge. You are not relating to a person. You are relating to an archetype in its most undeveloped form. The second stage moves from force to action. The animus becomes the man who does things, the romantic hero, the provider, the one who shapes the world through decisive movement. For men, the anima here becomes Helen of Troy. Beauty, romantic longing, the idealized beloved onto whom an entire emotional life is projected. This is the stage that produces the most culturally celebrated forms of love and the most spectacular collapses. Because when you have placed the full weight of your inner life onto another human being, the moment they fail to carry it, and they will, the devastation is not proportional to what actually happened between you. It is proportional to everything you refuse to develop in yourself. The third stage is where the pattern begins to shift. The animus becomes the bearer of the word, the teacher, the intellectual, the figure who gives meaning through language and vision. For men, the anima here becomes Mary, the spiritual, the devotional, the capacity for transcendence that is no longer purely erotic. Relationships at this stage are characterized by genuine depth, but also by a new danger, idealization of a different kind. The partner is no longer beautiful, they are sacred, and the sacred, when it disappoints, produces something closer to a crisis of faith than a broken heart. The fourth stage is the one almost nobody reaches without deliberate work. The animus becomes logos in its fullest sense, not opinion, not argument, not the sword of certainty, but genuine meaning-making capacity. Jung called this the spiritual guide in its truest form. For men, the anima here becomes Sophia, wisdom, the capacity to hold paradox without collapsing it, the inner feminine that no longer needs to be projected onto anyone because it has been made conscious. At this stage, the inner opposite becomes what Jung called a psychopomp, a guide between the conscious and unconscious, a mediator that deepens rather than destabilizes. The diagnostic question is not which stage you aspire to, it is which stage is actually operating in your life right now. You can identify it by looking at the quality of your projections. Who do you fall for? And what specifically is it about them that arrests you? What do you resent most intensely in the opposite sex? Because resentment of a quality in others is almost always the shadow of an undeveloped version of that quality in yourself. What do your recurring relationship patterns have in common beneath the surface differences of the people involved? The answers will be uncomfortable. That is the point. Because the stage you are locked in is not a moral failure, it is a developmental fact. And developmental facts can be changed, but only if you are willing to see them clearly first. You have never seen another person clearly. That is not an insult. It is a structural feature of the unintegrated psyche. When the anima or animus remains unconscious, it does not stay contained. It reaches outward, attaching itself to real people in your life and transforming them, in your experience, into something they are not. Jung described this mechanism in Aion with a precision that should stop you cold. Every mother, every beloved, every person who has ever arrested your attention with an intensity that seemed to exceed what the situation called for was being forced to carry an image that belonged to you. Every mother and every beloved, he wrote, is forced to become the carrier and embodiment of this omnipresent and ageless image, which corresponds to the deepest reality in a man. The deepest reality, not a distortion, not an error. The projection carries something real, a genuine dimension of your own psyche. That is exactly what makes it so difficult to withdraw. Projection does not feel like projection from the inside. It feels like perception. It feels like finally seeing someone clearly, like recognition, like the particular relief of encountering a person who seems to understand something about you that no one else has ever reached. The intensity of the feeling is not evidence that the perception is accurate. It is evidence that the archetype has been activated. And an activated archetype does not distinguish between the person in front of you and the image it has been carrying since before you were born. This is why the collapse of certain relationships produces grief that is wildly disproportionate to the actual duration or depth of what was shared. You are not mourning the person. You are mourning the withdrawal of the projection, the sudden loss of the screen onto which your own inner life had been playing. The person walks away and takes with them something that was never theirs to begin with. What remains is the original emptiness. The undeveloped dimension you had outsourced now returned to you without instructions. Here is the concrete practice. For the next 2 weeks, pay attention to the quality and intensity of your emotional reactions to specific people. Not the reactions that are proportional and explicable, but the ones that exceed the situation. The attraction that arrived before you knew anything about the person. The irritation that is sharper than the offense warrants. The admiration that feels closer to hunger than appreciation. These disproportionate responses are not personality quirks. They are a map of your projections, and by extension, a map of the undeveloped territory inside you. What you cannot stand in another person is almost always something you have refused to acknowledge in yourself. What you cannot stop wanting in another person is almost always a capacity you have not yet claimed as your own. The goal is not to stop projecting immediately. That is not possible, and not even desirable as a starting point. The goal is to begin noticing the moment the intensity exceeds the evidence. That noticing is the first act of withdrawal, and every projection you withdraw is a piece of your own psyche returned to you, raw, unfamiliar, and entirely yours to develop. If what you're hearing resonates with you, you'll find real value in my ebooks. Beyond the Shadow breaks down Jung's core ideas, while Dialogues with the Unconscious gives you a 30-day path to apply them in your life. Both are linked in the pinned comment. You know the feeling. Something is said, or not said, and suddenly you are no longer quite yourself. The response that comes out of your mouth is sharper than you intended, or softer, or it doesn't come at all, replaced by a silence that hardens into something you can't explain later. For a moment, sometimes longer, you are operating from a place that doesn't feel entirely like you, and the most unsettling part is not what you said or did. It is that, in the moment, it felt completely justified. It felt, in fact, like the clearest and most honest version of yourself you had accessed in years. Jung called this possession, not in the supernatural sense, in the precise psychological one. When the anima or animus remains unintegrated, it does not simply exert pressure from a distance. Under sufficient emotional charge, it takes over. The technical term is identification. The ego dissolves into the archetype, and what speaks is no longer the person, but the complex. In Aion, Jung described the effect as producing an unshakable feeling of rightness and righteousness, which is exactly why possession is so difficult to recognize from the inside. It doesn't feel like a loss of control. It feels like finally saying what needed to be said. For men, anima possession has a recognizable signature. It arrives as sentimentality that tips into resentment, as emotional reactivity that is disproportionate to the trigger, as a sulking withdrawal that the man himself cannot fully account for. The possessed man does not seem weak in the ordinary sense. He seems to himself profoundly wronged. The feeling is real. The interpretation is the anima's, not his. Jung noted that men in this state have been transformed into the animus of their own anima, meaning the very quality they resist most in others has colonized them from within. For women, animus possession looks different, but operates by the same logic. Emma Jung described it with clinical exactness. The woman ridden by the animus becomes unreachable by ordinary emotional means. Her position hardens into certainty. Every counter-argument becomes evidence of the opposition's bad faith. The animus, she wrote, draws his sword of power. And in that state, what the woman is defending is no longer her actual position, but the archetypes need to be right. The tragedy is that she is often the most intelligent person in the conversation. The animus has simply commandeered that intelligence and pointed it in the wrong direction. The practical question is not how to prevent this from happening. Not yet. The first step is simpler and more demanding. Learn to recognize it while it is happening, not after. The signal is always disproportional. The intensity of what you feel does not match the scale of what actually occurred. You are not angry at what just happened. You are angry at everything this moment resembles. When you notice that gap between the size of the reaction and the size of the event, stop. Do not act from that place. Do not speak from it either, if you can avoid it. Name it internally, even just as a fact. Something has been activated that is larger than this situation. That naming is not a resolution, but it is the beginning of the only thing that works, which is not suppression and not expression, but the deliberate act of refusing to be spoken through. Integration is not a feeling. It is not the moment you finally understand something about yourself, or the session where something clicks, or the conversation that leaves you feeling seen. Those things matter. They are not the work. The work is what happens after the insight, when you are back in the situation that always defeats you, and you do something different anyway. When the familiar pull arrives, and you recognize it for what it is, and choose, slowly and without drama, not to be carried by it. Integration is behavioral before it is psychological. You do not think your way into a more developed relationship with your anima or animus. You act your way there, repeatedly, in the specific conditions that have always made acting differently impossible. For men, the entry point into anima integration is almost always the body of emotional experience they have spent years outsourcing. Not emotional expression in the performative sense, not learning to cry at the right moments or describe feelings in therapy language. Something more fundamental. The willingness to sit with an emotional state long enough to know what it actually is before moving to dissolve it. Most men in contact with their unintegrated anima experience emotion as a problem to be solved. The integrated man experiences it as information to be read. The practice is specific. When an emotional reaction arrives, discomfort, longing, grief, tenderness, do not immediately explain it, deflect it, or act on it. Give it 60 seconds of undivided attention. Ask what it is pointing to. This is not therapy. It is a discipline, like any other, that builds a capacity that has atrophied from disuse. For women, the entry point into animus integration is almost always the body of judgment and assertion they have spent years rooting through other people's approval, not aggression. That is the unintegrated animus in its most primitive form, and it produces the rigidity Jung and Emma Jung both described. Something more precise, the willingness to form a position and hold it without immediately checking whether it is acceptable, comfortable, or welcome. The practice is equally specific. When you know what you think, say it plainly once, without the architecture of qualification that transforms a statement into a question. Not as a performance, as practice. The animus develops through use, not through understanding. Jung developed a technique he called active imagination, precisely for this work. A method of entering into deliberate dialogue with the figures that appear in dreams, fantasies, and emotional states. The process is straightforward in description and demanding in practice. You sit with the image or figure that has been recurring. The man who appears in your dreams, the woman whose quality arrests you in waking life, and you engage it consciously, in writing or in internal dialogue, as if it were a real interlocutor. You ask it what it wants. You listen to the answer without immediately editing it into something more comfortable. In the Archetypes and the collective unconscious, Jung was explicit that this is not a passive exercise. It requires the ego to remain present and engaged, neither swept away by the content nor dismissing it. The goal is relationship, not merger. You are not trying to become the anima or animus. You are trying to know it well enough that it stops ambushing you. The marker of genuine progress is not that the possessions stop entirely, it is that they shorten. The gap between activation and recognition shrinks. You still get pulled under, but you surface faster, and you know, with increasing clarity, what pulled you. That knowledge is not comfort, it is leverage. And leverage, applied consistently over time, is the only thing that actually changes the structure of a life. There is a version of this video that ends with a promise of harmony. The masculine and feminine within you finally reconciled, the inner war over, a sustainable peace achieved between the two halves of the psyche. That version would be lying to you. Jung did not promise harmony. He promised something harder and more useful: consciousness, the awareness of what is operating inside you, specific enough to be actionable, honest enough to be real. The anima and animus do not become quiet when integrated. They become legible. And legibility is not peace. It is a power of a different kind. The capacity to know what is moving in you before it moves you. What actually changes when integration progresses is the quality of what you build. The man who has made contact with his anima does not become softer in any diminished sense. He becomes capable of the kind of sustained emotional presence that makes him trustworthy in ways that matter. Not likable, not agreeable. Trustworthy, which is a different thing entirely, and rarer. The woman who has claimed her animus does not become harder. She becomes capable of acting from her own center without needing the situation to be safe first. She can hold a position under pressure not because she has armored herself, but because she has something real to stand on. Jung called the goal of this process the conjunctio, the union of opposites, not a romantic union, not the merger of masculine and feminine into some androgynous middle ground. The internal marriage of the two dimensions of the psyche into a functioning whole, each available to the conscious self without either one commandeering it. In Aion, he described the figures of anima and animus as the foundation stones of the psychic structure, which means you are not adding something new. You are finally using what was always there. The person on the other side of this work is not a better version of the self you already know. It is a larger one, capable of more range, more depth, more honest contact with other people, because they are no longer primarily screens for projection, but actual human beings encountered by someone who is no longer running from half of themselves. That is not a small thing. Most people never get there, not because the work is impossible, but because it requires something that comfort consistently defeats: the willingness to turn toward the part of yourself that has never been welcomed, and stay there long enough to learn what it is carrying. You already know which dimension you have been refusing. You have known it for a long time. The man who reads everything but cannot say what he feels. The woman who feels everything but cannot say what she thinks. The person who is endlessly competent in one register and chronically helpless in another. Start there. Not with a program, not with a framework, not with a plan. With one honest act in the direction of the half you have been withholding from yourself. One conversation you have been avoiding. One position you have been keeping private. One feeling you have been converting into something more manageable before anyone could see it. That is the whole of the first step. And if this video gave you the language to take it, then the one appearing on your screen right now will give you the next. Click to keep watching.